Is the modern progressive left actually the regressive left? Yes. ClearMaps analysis. Score 8 out of 50. Near total capture by the failure modes. This measures the dominant institutional and cultural form that took hold in Western universities, media, NGOs, and corporate HR after roughly 2010. It is built on identity politics, equity of outcomes over equal treatment, mandatory signaling, and the treatment of certain empirical questions as moral contamination. It scores the lived system, the incentives, the speech norms, the status games, and what happens when reality collides with the map. Let us walk through the 5 maps before further thoughts. Map 1, Minds. The progressive left scores 2 out of 10. The human mind was not designed for truth. It was shaped for survival in small groups where acceptance often mattered more than accuracy. When belief fuses with identity, the mind protects the model. The progressive left freely diagnoses this failure mode in its opponents. It almost never applies the same diagnosis to its own sacred claims about race, sex, disparities, or equity mechanisms. Updating on those claims carries extreme personal cost. Intelligence is routinely used as a sophisticated defense engine rather than a tool for correction. The mind stays wrong longer because staying wrong is safer. Map 2, Incentives and Coordination. The progressive left scores 1 out of 10. Systems produce what they reward. Inside this form, loyalty displays, equity metrics, and public purity raise status, resources, and security far more reliably than accuracy or correction. Career advancement, institutional funding, and social standing flow toward those who enforce the orthodoxy. Truth-telling or error correction on taboo topics lowers them. Decision-makers who enforce the orthodoxy are largely insulated from the downstream costs of failed interventions. Those costs fall on dissenters, students, patients, or the wider public. What gets measured is representation and compliance. What does not get measured is predictive accuracy. Coordination around the protected narrative becomes cheaper than coordination around reality. Map 3, Status and Capture. The progressive left scores 1 out of 10. Once belief fuses with identity and belonging, it becomes a status marker. Correct views function as membership tests. The progressive toolkit of identity shields, racist, bigot, transphobe, Islamophobe, far-right, operates as a rapid purity test. Deployed early, these labels collapse inquiry into moral failure and raise the social price of further questions. Ambitious actors use the language for rank. Administrative expansion of DEI offices, corporate signaling, and ideology-aligned career tracks show the capture pattern clearly. Mechanisms that would decouple status from doctrine are weak or absent. The map is no longer being tested, it is being defended. Map 4, Error Correction. The progressive left scores 1 out of 10. Error correction is fragile. It only functions when the cost of surfacing inconvenient facts is lower than the cost of remaining wrong. Here, the cost is extreme. Internal critics face career and reputational risk as routine. Formal channels for criticism are constrained. Willingness to revise core claims is low. Continuous training, statements, and policing are required to keep the system intact. When evidence arrives that collides with the map, the first response is rarely revision. It is usually an attempt to raise the price of the data still higher. That is the runaway train. The system cannot cheaply correct, so it hardens. Under existential framing, when opponents are cast as fascists, Nazis, or existential threats, the ratchet accelerates. Extreme tactics become status-enhancing rather than costly. Map 5, Scale. The progressive left scores 3 out of 10. Scale changes the game. What might remain a private moral preference becomes destructive once it captures universities, media, corporations, and government. Distance between decisions and consequences grows. Quiet failure accumulates for years, viewpoint monocultures, declining institutional trust, speech climates that punish noticing. The system does not adapt from within. It requires external shock, and once installed at institutional scale, it begins to consume the host society's ability to discuss ordinary trade-offs cleanly. Even those outside the ideology feel the cost of speaking. Elite capture produces both institutional monocultures and the street-level and cultural extremes that follow once the existential frame is locked in. Further thoughts: the maps interact. Identity protective minds create incentives to defend and coordinate around status linked beliefs. Those beliefs become purity tests. The purity tests raise the price of error correction. At institutional scale, the pattern becomes self reinforcing. The result is not quiet stagnation, it is hardening. This structure produces a sharp asymmetry. Speech that touches the sacred claims is treated as near catastrophic harm. Actual violence against political opponents or extreme individual cases that can be framed as systemic failure is rapidly moralized in the opposite direction, minimized, celebrated, or converted into further proof of the map's righteousness. The cost of noticing is raised. The cost of the protected narrative is lowered. That is the runaway train in cultural form. Public-facing DEI language has retreated in many large institutions under legal and political pressure. That is real. The underlying status incentives and low tolerance for dissent on the sacred claims often persist, including in ordinary workplaces. Surface retreat is not the same as rewriting the operating costs. The numbers make the deeper irony clear. The progressive left's preferred economic and political vocabulary is socialism, Marxism, and communism. It treats capitalism as the root pathology, yet on the ClearMaps the ranking runs the other way. Capitalism scores in the low 30s, classical liberalism scores around 39, communism scores 4, fascism and National Socialism score 1, Marxism scores 6. The modern progressive institutional form sits at 8, far closer to the high-cost end of the spectrum it claims to oppose than to the lower-cost systems it attacks. The same form that freely labels its opponents fascists operates with the tight identity fusion, status protection, and fragile error correction that the maps associate with the most costly systems of the 20th century. The irony is structural, not rhetorical. Classical liberalism and market systems keep update costs lower and status less fused to contested claims. The modern progressive form abandoned that tradition. It replaced equal treatment with equity of outcomes, open inquiry with protected categories, and error correction with moral enforcement. The costs are no longer theoretical. They are visible in institutional trust, speech climates, educational outcomes, and the growing number of people who can feel the distortion but still calculate that saying so out loud remains too expensive. The maps do not require conspiracy. They only require the measured cost structure, tight identity fusion, status protection of the doctrine, and error correction made socially toxic. Once those features are in place, the system runs itself. Under existential framing, it escalates. It will keep running until the external costs finally exceed the internal rewards of staying wrong. That is the operating cost of the regressive left.